Hey viewers, welcome to the channel. This is Plasma 1945 and today we're going to talk about bunker problems or putting tires on a fire. Or another way to get your wheels up. Well, it's all about those tires and wheels on Russian bombers and cargo planes. Yes, we're going to dig into that and explain why that's happening. Before we do that, shout out to Fox 3 MS. As you know, we fly DCS World. It is a sim. And you can fly with friends and with people around the internet, and Fox 3 will set up dedicated servers for you without you needing to be a nerd or a tech. Simple, easy, affordable Fox 3 MS, ready to fly. Now let's get back to those tires on top of airplanes. In the last year and a half, 2 years, there has been more and more attacks on Russian bases by drones sent out from Ukraine. Whether they are propeller-powered drones made out of balsa wood, carrying a grenade, or complex radio-controlled high-range jet-propelled drones, they are hitting bases further and further away from the border of Ukraine, flying into Russian territory. And as a result, multiple aircraft have been hit. And now we're seeing a response. This response are sets of tires on top of strategic supersonic bombers like the Tu-160. Tires on top of Tu-95 bombers and cargo planes all over Russian air bases. A number of Russian aircraft have been destroyed by these drones, and the tires are supposed to help. Now you might be wondering, how are a bunch of rubber tires going to help against the drone? Because the drone does carry usually an explosive charge, a high explosive charge that will blow up a airplane, or at least damage it enough that it'll be out of circulation for a very long time, and we've seen that over the last few months more and more. And things are getting more ridiculous. Not only bombers are being covered with tires, but there's footage of an Su-34, that's basically an F-15, F-111 mix, somewhere around there, that is also covered in tires, including its ECM pylon. Can the tires make that big of a difference though? In theory, synthetic aperture radar on satellites, RC-135 planes and other recon aircraft can have trouble seeing the metallic outline of an airplane during a spy mission if they're covered in rubber, which will reflect less radio signal back. Same thing with thermals, perhaps it can shield it, but the biggest theory is that it's also supposed to confuse However, the biggest idea is probably it is to confuse the optical sensors that are looking for targets as these drones head towards the airfields if they're not remotely controlled. But you're thinking there's got to be a better way. Why park airplanes outside like it's World War I or II? And as a matter of fact, during World War I and II, it was only the Nazis that really built deep entrenched bunkers. Despite the lessons during the beginning of World War II, where the Russian Air Force was basically shot up by German Stukas, no one really built bunkers. Whether it was because there was aircraft carriers on the side of the United States, which were, simply put, naval airfields out at sea, which are fairly well defended unless a kamikaze hits you, or frontline aviation locations such as those built on the Pacific Islands. Those didn't really have bunkers. In addition, bunkers were really used for maintenance and support more than anything else during World War II. During the Cold War, the tendency continued, but for a different reason. Mainly because most aircraft in the early Cold War were on the sides of nations which did not want to get into war. So we're talking in the Korean War, many of the aircraft were based either far behind enemy lines, which could not be reached by regular aircraft that would carry bombs out to take those air bases out, or they were in, say, China or close to the Chinese border during the Korean and Vietnam War. And of course, any attack on Chinese territory may lead a nuclear counteroffensive, or may even bring the Chinese on the side of the Vietnamese. And of course, the US knew what happened when China got involved in the Korean War, and no, nobody wanted to bring in the Chinese with their full force on the side of the Vietnamese. So any Vietnamese air bases were off limits if they were close to the border with China. So airplanes were pretty safe.
And the aircraft also had to stay out of a buffer zone along the border with China. It was in the northeastern quadrant that the North Vietnamese had built up the heaviest concentrations of fighters and anti-aircraft missiles. To the intense frustration of U.S. air commanders, American planes were strictly forbidden to attack North Vietnamese fighter bases. The fear in the White House was that Chinese or Soviet advisors might be killed, provoking retaliation.
things changed drastically in 1968 when the Israeli Air Force carried out an attack, sneaking in below the SAM radars and destroyed most of the Egyptian Air Force on the ground.
Operation Focus, which aimed to destroy the Egyptian Air Force. Israeli aircraft attacked 14 Egyptian airfields and caught them absolutely off guard. 338 Egyptian aircraft were destroyed and 100 pilots were killed within 3 hours.
That's right, the SAMs, which were supposed to protect the air bases, weren't able to stop the low-flying Israeli aircraft. Planes were parked outdoors and were bombed to smithereens. The sneak attack worked, and lessons were learned very quickly around the world after that attack. As a matter of fact, it was a 6-day war that really changed things around, and USSR was quick to the beat. After the 6-day war, in 1 year, by 1969, over 800 concrete reinforced arch bunkers were built. By 1970, 1,400 were built by the Soviet Union around the Warsaw Pact countries. These bunkers were made out of steel reinforced concrete, stable and thick enough to withstand a nearby nuclear explosion or a direct hit from a bomb. Now, mind you, penetrators weren't around at that time, but from the bombs of the time, and we're talking Mark 82s, maybe Mark 84s. Also, early cruise missiles or artillery, though these bunkers could withstand, meaning that the aircraft were safe. This was done to prevent your Air Force, Soviet Air Force, from being destroyed at the onset of a war. Over 3,800 bunkers were built by the USSR by 1986, and it was thought that the Air Force was safe. There was only one problem. The purpose of the bunkers was to defend the first strike frontline aviation built by Soviet Union in Warsaw Pact countries. And here's the key word: protect the Air Force from being destroyed at the front line. Now, where is the front line for Soviet Union? Well, for Soviet Union, the front line was nowhere close. It was the countries that formed the Warsaw Pact. We're talking Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Romania. That's right, that's where all the bunkers were built. In addition, bunkers were also built along the western side of Soviet Union, in republics such as Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Ukraine. As a matter of fact, all those republics are now separate countries with nothing to do with Russia. And so, all the bunkers that were built outside of the Soviet Union, because by the time attacks got to Soviet Union, either nuclear Armageddon would have happened or the war would have been over by negotiations. So the bunkers were never built in Soviet Union, guys. And things got worse. Well, actually no, first things got better, because 1990 rolled around, 1991 perestroika, Gorbachev, and, well, first Russia went broke and had no money to build any more bunkers. But also the USSR broke up, and the Cold War was over. There was going to be no wars. It was world peace through and through. And, of course, well, Russia had an air force. Nobody was funding it. It was falling apart. So why build bunkers in Russia if peace was going to reign supreme very soon? And indeed, all the bunkers that were left over in Eastern Europe, Poland, Romania, and there was one other catch. All those bunkers were too small for the Air Force that Russia decided to keep. The MiG-21s and the MiG-29s, the Su-17s, were the main aircraft supplied to the satellite countries of the Warsaw Pact. And so the bunker design of the Soviet Union meant that those bunkers were meant for those smaller aircraft. A flanker, Su-27, Su-34, are huge. And they wouldn't fit in the old bunkers. And of course, because of standards, communism, well, bigger bunkers were not really commonly designed. Bombers? Well, bombers were supposed to be at least 2,000 kilometers away from the front lines. And if you consider 2,000 kilometers or 1,500 kilometers being East Germany, well, that's pretty close to Moscow. Well, now we know that with NATO being so much closer, without all those buffer nations, all of a sudden it's only 200 to 500 kilometers from the closest NATO ally to the strategic air bases with complex, expensive AWACSs, Tu-160 supersonic bombers, and Tu-95 Bears. Indeed, this was a huge miscalculation of Russia. What about the United States? Well, we know that in the NATO countries in Europe, there was plenty of bunkers built all over Western Europe, England, Turkey, and many other areas. Many of these bunkers are designed for larger aircraft such as the F-15, the F-111, as well as larger facilities which can maintain and take care of bomber aircraft. Of course, putting a bomber in a bunker is almost impossible, but there have been some designs shown for the B-21, which would be an environmental cover. And as a matter of fact, these light environmental covers deployed at US bases in Japan, in the Middle East, are excellent for protecting the aircraft from the sun and harsh weather, but also can serve as camouflage so that a drone operator doesn't know exactly under which cover sits an aircraft that is very valuable, whereas a piece of material and even reinforced concrete is much cheaper. As a matter of fact, deployments have been made of newer bunkers in many locations used by NATO air forces. But let's get back to Russia, which by the 90s had fallen apart. The borders of countries which were no longer Russia and buffer states were right there around the corner, and of course Russia was completely broke. First off, it didn't know it needed an air force, and when it decided to rebuild the air force, that's where the money went, not into building bunkers. So what should be done? Well, you got to call Boris the Builder to start building those bunkers. In the interim, those storage and light cover facilities which can protect the aircraft, at least from sight and from weather, could be helpful because the drones would know where to attack the aircraft. Take the bombers away from the areas which are within 400 kilometers of the front lines, otherwise all your transport aviation AWACS are all going to be hit. The United States is leading the world in having those light coverings on their facilities, and this is pretty important. So with that in mind, I think that's the solution that really Russia has to follow, because at this point, putting tires on top of the aircraft is no good. China, unlike Russia, has been building bunkers for the J-10s and the J-11s. Indeed, China has been building reinforced bunkers this entire time. Same thing with Iran. They've been building bunkers underneath mountains to protect their small air force, whereas Russia parks their aircraft out in the snow and the rain because, as you know, the only threat to a Russian airplane isn't the cold weather, the vodka, or the bears. It's a small Ukrainian drone that costs $1,000 that can take out a multi-million-dollar supersonic strategic bomber. So there you go, guys. That's who stole all of Russian bunkers. And now you know the rest of the story. Well, anyhow, hopefully you enjoyed this video. Share, subscribe, comment below if you agree or disagree. And if you found it interesting, please share it with your friends.